The wind howled like 1,000 wolves as Eleanor Hayes stumbled through knee-deep snow, her fingers numb inside threadbare gloves, desperately searching for any scraps of wood that might keep her alive through the night. The blizzard had come without warning that February morning in 1884, sweeping across the Montana Territory with a fury that turned the world into nothing but white chaos. Eleanor had been foolish to venture out, but the small cabin her late husband had left her was already growing cold, and she had burned through the last of her firewood 2 days prior. At 23 years old, she had been widowed for 8 months, and every day since Thomas's death from pneumonia had been a struggle to survive on this unforgiving land. Her lungs burned as she bent to retrieve a frozen branch, adding it to the pitiful bundle in her arms. The wind tore at her wool coat, finding every gap and hole to send icy fingers against her skin. She could barely see 5 feet in front of her, and panic was beginning to set in. Had she wandered too far from the cabin, would she be able to find her way back? Eleanor turned in what she hoped was the right direction, clutching her meager collection of wood. Each step was a battle against the wind that seemed determined to knock her down. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and cold. She had maybe enough wood here to last through the evening, but certainly not through the night, and definitely not through tomorrow if this storm continued. Then she heard it. Through the screaming wind, the sound of hooves and a voice calling out. Eleanor squinted through the wall of white, her heart hammering. Out here alone, a woman could encounter any manner of danger, but she was already dying from the cold, so perhaps it did not matter. A massive dark shape emerged from the blizzard. A horse, she realized, and atop it a man bundled in a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. He pulled up beside her, and even through the storm she could see the concern in his eyes. "Ma'am, what in God's name are you doing out here?" His voice was deep and rough, but there was genuine worry in it. "Firewood," Eleanor managed through chattering teeth, holding up her pathetic bundle as if that explained everything. The cowboy stared at her for a long moment, then dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall, she noticed, even as she swayed on her feet. "Where's your cabin?" Eleanor pointed in what she hoped was the right direction. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges. Without another word, the stranger took the wood from her arms, then to her shock, lifted her onto his horse. "Hold on," he commanded, and she found herself obeying, gripping the saddle horn with what little strength remained in her frozen fingers. He took the reins and began leading the horse forward, somehow navigating through the blinding snow with a confidence she could not fathom. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the dark shape of her cabin emerged from the white. The cowboy helped her down, then half-carried her to the door. "Inside," he said. "Get by the stove, I'll tend to things out here." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to ask what he meant, but she was too cold and too tired. She stumbled inside, leaving the door for him to close, and made her way to the iron stove that sat cold and dark in the corner of the single room. Her fingers were too numb to strike a match. She stood there, shaking violently, staring at the stove as if willing it to light itself. The door opened and closed. The cowboy was inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He took in the situation with one glance, then moved to the stove. From somewhere he produced matches and kindling, and within moments had coaxed a small flame to life. He fed it carefully, building it up, and Eleanor felt the first hint of warmth. "Sit," he instructed, pulling the only chair closer to the stove. She obeyed, sinking into it gratefully. He opened the stove door wider, letting more heat into the room. "You got coffee?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "In the tin by the basin." He found it, filled her dented coffee pot with water from the bucket by the door, and set it on the stove. Only then did he remove his snow-covered hat and coat, hanging them by the door. Eleanor got her first good look at him. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. A scar ran along his jawline, and his eyes were a striking gray color that seemed to see everything. "Name's James Cordell," he said, crouching to warm his hands by the stove. I was riding back to the ranch when the storm hit. Saw smoke from what I thought was your chimney earlier, figured there might be shelter here. Eleanor Hayes, she replied, and there has been no smoke. I ran out of wood. James glanced at the wood box, which was indeed empty, then at the sparse furnishings of the cabin. His expression remained neutral, but she saw understanding in his eyes. You out here alone? My husband died last spring, pneumonia. The words still hurt to say. James nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss, he stood. That wood you were collecting wouldn't have lasted an hour. Your shed out back, is it empty? Nearly, Eleanor admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. I've been trying to gather what I can, but with the snow. Right. James moved to the door, pulling his coat back on. I'll be back. Wait, Eleanor called, struggling to her feet. The storm will kill you for certain if we don't get you proper wood, James said firmly. I know what I'm doing, Mrs. Hayes. Stay by that fire. He disappeared into the blizzard before she could protest further. Eleanor sank back into the chair, worry gnawing at her. She did not even know this man. Why would he risk himself for her? The coffee began to boil, and she forced herself to stand and tend to it, pouring 2 cups with shaking hands. Time passed. The fire James had built began to die down, and Eleanor fed it the last few pieces of wood from her pathetic bundle. Where was he? Had he gotten lost? Had she sent a stranger to his death? Then the door opened and James appeared, his arms loaded with wood. He dumped it by the stove, then immediately headed back out. Eleanor watched in amazement as he made trip after trip, bringing in enough wood to fill not just the box but stack along the wall. Snow clung to his coat and hat, his face was red with cold, but he did not stop. Finally, he paused long enough to catch his breath. Found a stand of dead trees about 200 yards northwest, he said. Your shed's about half full now. This should get you through a few days at least. How did you in this storm? Eleanor could not finish the sentence. James shrugged, adding wood to the fire. Grew up in Wyoming territory, you learn to navigate by feel and instinct. Besides, I tied a rope from here to there so I wouldn't get lost. He noticed the coffee. That for me? Yes. Eleanor handed him a cup, and he wrapped his large hands around it gratefully. They stood in silence for a moment, drinking the bitter coffee. The cabin was warming up now, the fire crackling cheerfully. Eleanor studied her unexpected savior, this cowboy who had appeared from nowhere and likely saved her life. Why? She finally asked. You do not know me. James met her eyes over the rim of his cup. Out here we help each other. It is the only way to survive. He paused. Besides, I couldn't leave a woman to freeze to death. What kind of man would that make me? Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness without expecting something in return. Thank you, she said softly. I do not know how I can repay you. Don't need repayment. James finished his coffee and glanced toward the small window, though nothing was visible through the white. Storm's getting worse. If you don't mind, I should probably stay until it passes. I can bed down by the fire. My horse is in your shed out of the wind. Eleanor knew she should probably be frightened, allowing a strange man to stay in her cabin overnight. But something about James Cordell made her feel safe rather than threatened. Perhaps it was the way he had not hesitated to help her, or the respectful distance he maintained, or simply the quiet steadiness in his eyes. Of course, she said, it would be foolish for you to try to travel in this. As the afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor busied herself preparing a meal from her limited supplies. She had flour and a bit of salt pork, some dried beans that had been soaking, and that was about it. It was not much, but it was what she could offer. James, meanwhile, continued to tend the fire and brought in more wood until he was satisfied they had enough to last through the night and the next day. They ate in companionable silence, Eleanor acutely aware of how strange it was to have another person in the cabin after months of solitude. James had good manners, she noticed, thanking her for the meal and insisting on helping clean up despite her protests. You work on a ranch? Eleanor asked as they settled by the fire, James on the floor with his back against the wall, Eleanor in her chair with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "The Double Bar Ranch, about 10 miles east of here," James replied. "Been there 3 years now. Good outfit, fair boss. We run cattle, mostly. And you were out in this storm," was checking on one of our line shacks, making sure it was stocked for when the boys need it, "was heading back when the storm hit." He paused. "What about you? How have you been managing out here alone?" Eleanor looked down at her hands. "Barely," she admitted. "Thomas and I came out here 2 years ago full of hope and dreams. We were going to build a real ranch, raise cattle and horses. But he got sick last April and by May he was gone. I have been trying to hold on to the land, but—" She trailed off, the enormity of her situation pressing down on her. "You have anyone, family?" "Not anymore. My parents died of cholera when I was 16. Thomas was all I had." Eleanor blinked back tears. "I should probably sell and move to town, find work, but this land is all I have left of him. And I am stubborn, I suppose." James was quiet for a long moment. "Stubbornness can be a virtue out here, but so can knowing when to ask for help." "I am not accustomed to accepting charity," Eleanor said stiffly. "It is not charity to help a neighbor," James replied gently, "and it seems to me you could use a hand getting through the winter." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she was too tired and, if she was honest, too relieved to have another human being to talk to. Instead, she asked, "What about you? Do you have family?" "Parents died when I was young. Grew up working ranches, moving from place to place. Never really had a home, I guess." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. "That sounds lonely." James looked at her, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. "It has been," he said quietly. The wind howled outside, battering the cabin, but inside it was warm and almost cozy. They talked as the evening wore on, carefully at first, then with increasing ease. James told her about his work, the hard life of a cowboy, the beauty and brutality of the land. Eleanor spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her dreams of adventure that had led her west, the reality that had been both harder and more wondrous than she had imagined. "I fell in love with Montana the first time I saw it," Eleanor confessed. "Even though it has nearly killed me several times, I cannot imagine being anywhere else." "I know what you mean," James said. "This land gets into your blood. I have been from Texas to Wyoming, and Montana feels the most like home of anywhere I have been." When Eleanor's eyes began to droop with exhaustion, James insisted she take the bed in the corner while he made a pallet by the fire. She protested weakly, but he was firm. "You have been out in the cold and you need proper rest," he said. "I will be fine here." "Done plenty of sleeping on the ground." Eleanor finally relented, too tired to argue further. She lay down in her narrow bed, still fully clothed except for her boots, and pulled her quilts up to her chin. Across the room, she could see James settling by the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the comforting sound of wood crackling in the stove and the presence of another person breathing in the darkness. She woke once in the deepest part of night to find James adding wood to the fire, keeping the cabin warm. He moved quietly, efficiently, and she felt a rush of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She had been alone for so long, fighting so hard just to survive, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether she lived or died. Morning came gray and still howling with wind. Eleanor woke to find James already up, the fire blazing and the scent of coffee in the air. He had found her last eggs and was frying them with the remaining salt pork. "Morning," he said when he saw her stirring. "Storm's still raging. Won't be safe to travel today." Eleanor sat up, running her hands through her tangled hair. She must look a fright, but James did not seem to notice or care. "You found the eggs. Hope you do not mind. Figured we both needed a decent breakfast." He handed her a plate, and Eleanor took it gratefully. They ate together as the storm raged outside, and Eleanor found herself studying James when she thought he was not looking. He was handsome, she supposed, though in a rough, weathered way, but it was more than that. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that drew her. And the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention made her heart beat faster. "James," she said suddenly, setting down her plate, "why are you really doing all this?" "The wood, the food, staying to help me." He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes serious. "Honestly, please. Because from the moment I saw you out there in the blizzard, looking like you were about to collapse, something in me needed to make sure you were all right." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "And because in the time we have been talking, I have felt more at home than I have in years. I know that probably sounds foolish." "It does not," Eleanor interrupted softly. "I feel it too." The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. James set down his own plate and moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. "Mrs. Hayes, Eleanor, I know we just met. I know this is probably too forward, but I would like to come back once the storm clears, to check on you, to help you with your place if you would allow it." Eleanor's heart was racing. She knew she should be cautious, should protect herself, but something about James felt right in a way she could not explain. "I would like that very much." James smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his face, and Eleanor found herself smiling back. His hand reached out, gently taking hers, and she let him. His calloused palm was warm and strong, and she realized how much she had missed simple human contact. They spent the rest of that day talking, sharing stories, learning each other. James spoke of his childhood in Wyoming, losing his parents to a wagon accident when he was 14, the years of hard work and loneliness that followed. Eleanor told him about her life in St. Louis, her father's work as a clerk, her mother's dreams of something more, and how those dreams had been passed down to her daughter. "Thomas was a good man," Eleanor said at one point, feeling she owed it to her late husband's memory to say it. "He treated me well, and I cared for him. But if I am being honest, we married more for practical reasons than for love. I needed someone to take me west, and he needed a wife to help build a homestead. We were partners more than anything else." "You do not need to explain yourself to me," James said gently. "We all do what we need to do to survive. I know, but I want to be honest with you." Eleanor looked directly at him. "When Thomas died, I grieved. I still grieve the loss of a good man and the future we might have had. But I do not think I understood what it meant to feel truly drawn to someone until yesterday." James's eyes widened slightly. "Eleanor, I know it is fast," she continued, the words tumbling out now. "I know people would say it is too soon, that I am being foolish. But out here we do not have the luxury of time. Life is hard and short, and when something good comes along, should we not grab hold of it?" "Yes," James said hoarsely. He moved closer, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. "God, yes, we should." When he kissed her, it was tender and careful, as if she were something precious. Eleanor melted into it, her hands clutching his shirt, and felt something inside her that had been frozen for so long begin to thaw. This was different from anything she had experienced with Thomas. This was heat and connection and a feeling of rightness that went bone deep. They broke apart, both breathing hard. James rested his forehead against hers. "I did not come here expecting this," he whispered. "Neither did I," Eleanor replied, "but I am not sorry it happened. Neither am I." The storm continued through the night and into the next day, but neither of them minded. They existed in their own warm bubble, talking and laughing and stealing kisses by the fire. James was respectful, never pushing for more than Eleanor was willing to give, but the attraction between them was undeniable. They would catch each other's eyes across the cabin and smile, or their hands would brush and linger. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Eleanor woke to weak sunlight streaming through the window and a silence that felt almost loud after days of howling wind. James was already up, looking outside. "It has passed," he said, but there was no joy in his voice. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew what that meant. James would leave, would return to his ranch, and she would be alone again. The thought was almost unbearable after these days of companionship and growing connection. James turned to her, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "I have to go back to the ranch," he said. "They will be worried, and there is work to be done after a storm like this." "I know," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I meant what I said. I am coming back." James crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "If you will have me, Eleanor, I want to court you properly. I want to help you with this place, to make sure you are safe and cared for, and in time, if you feel the same way I do, I want to make you my wife." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "You want to marry me, more than I have wanted anything in my entire life." James's voice was fierce with sincerity. "I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not care. These past 3 days with you have been the best of my life, and I am not fool enough to let you go." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, I will have you, yes to all of it." James pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. Eleanor clung to him, happiness and relief flooding through her in equal measure. She was not alone anymore. Against all odds, in the middle of a blizzard, she had found someone who saw her, who cared for her, who wanted to build a life with her. When they finally separated, James began gathering his things. "I will be back tomorrow," he promised, "and I will bring supplies, food and wood and whatever else you need. We will get you through the rest of this winter, Eleanor, and then we will figure out the rest together." Eleanor walked him to the door where his horse was waiting in the shed and watched as he saddled up. The world outside was white and pristine, the snow glittering in the weak sunlight. James mounted, then leaned down to kiss her one more time. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," Eleanor agreed. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride away across the snow, his dark figure growing smaller against the white landscape. But this time, she was not afraid of being alone, because she knew he was coming back. True to his word, James returned the next day with a pack horse loaded with supplies. Flour and coffee and beans and bacon, blankets and lamp oil and matches. He spent the day chopping wood and repairing the shed door that had been hanging loose. Eleanor cooked for him, and they ate together, falling back into the easy companionship they had found during the storm. Over the following weeks, James came as often as his ranch duties would allow. Sometimes it was just for an afternoon, sometimes he could stay overnight, sleeping by the fire as he had that first night. Slowly but surely, Eleanor's cabin became more secure, her supplies more adequate. But more than that, her life became fuller, richer, happier. James was different from any man she had known. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, treated her as an equal partner. He was also gentle and patient, never rushing her, always letting her set the pace of their physical intimacy. But the attraction between them grew stronger with each passing day, and Eleanor found herself counting the hours until she would see him again. Spring came slowly to Montana, the snow melting gradually, revealing the brown earth beneath. James brought Eleanor to meet his boss at the Double Bar Ranch, a gruff but kind older man named Samuel Hawkins who took one look at them together and grinned. "About time you found yourself a good woman, Cordell," Hawkins said. "When is the wedding?" "As soon as Eleanor will have me," James replied, squeezing her hand. They were married in late April at the small church in the nearest town, a settlement called Silver Creek about 15 miles from Eleanor's cabin. It was a simple ceremony with only a handful of witnesses, mostly cowboys from the Double Bar and a few townspeople who had gotten to know Eleanor. She wore her best dress, a blue calico she had carefully mended and pressed, and James wore his cleanest shirt and a new vest he had purchased specially for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her with such tenderness and joy that Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. This was love, she realized. Real, deep, abiding love. Not the practical partnership she had known before, but something that made her feel alive and whole and cherished. They spent their first night as husband and wife back at the cabin, which they had decided would be their home at least for the time being. James had been given a few days off from the ranch for the wedding, and he used them to show Eleanor just how deeply he loved her. Their joining was everything Eleanor had never known to hope for, passionate and tender, and filled with whispered words of love. In the days and weeks that followed, they fell into a rhythm of life together. James continued to work at the double bar, but he was home every night, and they spent their evenings planning their future. They would stay on Eleanor's land, they decided, but expand it. James had saved money over his years of work, and combined with what little Eleanor had managed to hold on to, they could purchase a few head of cattle, some chickens, maybe a milk cow. Samuel Hawkins, who had taken a liking to both of them, offered to help them get started, selling them young cattle at a fair price and giving James advice on building up the ranch. Other neighbors, once they realized Eleanor was no longer alone, also pitched in with help and guidance. It turned out the community Eleanor had felt so isolated from during her widowhood had simply not known how to help a woman alone, but with James by her side, they were welcomed and embraced. That first summer of their marriage was full of hard work, but also of joy. They built a proper barn for the animals, expanded the cabin to have 2 rooms instead of 1, and put in a larger garden. Eleanor learned the intricacies of ranch management, and James discovered he had a talent for breeding cattle that could withstand the harsh Montana winters. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, and fell into bed exhausted but happy each night. By the time the first snow fell in October, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She told James one evening as they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "James," she said softly, "there is something I need to tell you." He looked down at her, concern immediately filling his eyes. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Eleanor said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, James simply stared at her as if he could not quite comprehend the words. Then his face broke into the biggest smile Eleanor had ever seen. "A baby, truly, truly. I think it will come in late spring." James pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have given me everything, a home, a future, and now a child. I love you so much." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered into his chest. "More than I ever thought possible." The winter passed more easily than the previous one, and not just because they had ample supplies and a warm cabin. Eleanor was happy, truly happy, perhaps for the first time in her life. Yes, she was often tired and occasionally sick with the pregnancy, but she was surrounded by love and support. James doted on her, refusing to let her do any heavy work and bringing her little treats from town when he went for supplies. Their neighbors, especially the women, rallied around Eleanor as her pregnancy progressed. They brought baby clothes and blankets, shared advice and stories, and promised to be there when her time came. Eleanor, who had felt so alone during her first years in Montana, now felt herself part of a real community. The baby came on a warm May evening, almost exactly a year after Eleanor and James's wedding. It was a long labor, and James paced outside the cabin while 2 neighboring women attended to Eleanor. When he finally heard the cry of his newborn child, he burst through the door, not caring about propriety. "It is a boy," one of the women said, smiling. "A healthy, strong boy." James went to Eleanor's side where she lay exhausted but radiant, cradling their son. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is," James agreed, tears streaming openly down his face as he looked at his wife and child. "You are both perfect." They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's first husband, because, as James said, "If it were not for him bringing you out here, we never would have found each other. He deserves to be remembered." Little Thomas was indeed healthy and strong, with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Watching James with their son, seeing the gentleness and love with which he held the tiny boy, Eleanor fell in love with her husband all over again. The years passed in a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment. Their ranch grew slowly but steadily. They acquired more cattle, built a larger barn, and eventually added 2 more rooms to the cabin, turning it into a proper house. James's reputation as a skilled rancher grew, and people began coming to him for advice on breeding cattle and surviving the harsh Montana winters. 2 years after Thomas was born, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, a tiny, delicate thing who nevertheless had a will of iron from her first breath. 2 years after that came another son, William, who was the most easygoing of their children, content to watch the world with solemn eyes. Eleanor sometimes thought back to that terrible day when she had been stumbling through the blizzard, certain she was going to die alone and forgotten. It seemed like another lifetime now, as if it had happened to someone else. She was no longer that frightened, desperate woman. She was a wife, a mother, a rancher, a valued member of her community. But what she treasured most was the love she shared with James. It had not faded with time, as she had seen happen in some marriages. Instead, it had deepened and grown richer. They still stole moments to kiss in the barn, still lay awake at night talking after the children were asleep, still looked at each other across the dinner table and smiled at private jokes and shared memories. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Eleanor on a rare trip away from the ranch, leaving the children with neighbors for 2 nights. They rode out to a beautiful meadow in the high country, where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color and a stream ran crystal clear. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" James asked as they sat by the stream watching the sun set. "I said many things," Eleanor replied, smiling. "You said that life out here is hard and short, and when something good comes along, we should grab hold of it." James took her hand. "You were the best thing that ever came into my life, Eleanor, and I have grabbed hold and never let go." "I am glad you did not," Eleanor said softly. "You saved my life that day in the blizzard, James, in more ways than one. And you saved mine," James replied. "I was just drifting before I found you, going through the motions of living without really understanding what it meant. You gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to wake up every morning grateful for another day." They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life together through determination, hard work, and love. As the years continued to pass, their children grew tall and strong. Thomas took after his father, quiet and steady, with a natural gift for working with animals. Grace was fierce and independent, determined to prove she could do anything her brothers could do. William was the dreamer of the family, always with a book in hand when he could manage it, talking of someday seeing the wider world. The Montana Territory became the state of Montana in 1889, and James and Eleanor voted together for the first time in the new state's elections. Their ranch, which they had named the Blizzard Creek Ranch after the storm that had brought them together, was now one of the most respected in the county. They employed several ranch hands, and their cattle bore a brand known for quality. But through all the changes and growth, the core of their life remained the same. Family, hard work, and the love that had bloomed between a desperate widow and a cowboy in a blizzard remained the foundation of everything they built. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled outside much as it had that first night, Eleanor and James would sit by the fire with their children and tell the story of how they met. The children never tired of hearing it, of imagining their mother nearly freezing to death and their father appearing like a hero from a storybook to save her. "Did you know right away that you loved him?" Grace would always ask, her eyes shining. "Not right away," Eleanor would admit. "But very soon. Sometimes the heart knows things before the mind does." "I knew the moment I saw her," James would add, pulling Eleanor close. "I just did not want to scare her by saying so too quickly." The children would giggle and Eleanor would blush and James would kiss her temple, and they would all sit together in the warmth and light, a family built on love and chance and a blizzard that had changed everything. As Eleanor and James grew older, they watched their children begin to make their own ways in the world. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving to be as skilled and steady as his father. Grace eventually fell in love with a doctor who had moved to Silver Creek, and they married in a ceremony that was far grander than her parents' simple wedding had been. William, true to his dreams, went east to college, but always returned for summers and holidays, his love for the land too deep to ever truly leave it behind. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, Eleanor and James sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over land they had claimed and tamed together. They were in their early 50s now, graying and weathered, but still strong, still vital, still deeply in love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that storm had not hit?" Eleanor asked, her hand in James's as it had been 1,000 times before. "Every day," James admitted. "And every day I thank God for that blizzard. It brought me to you." "We could have passed each other 100 times in town and never met," Eleanor mused. "Or met and not felt the connection we did. Timing and fate are strange things." "I prefer to think it was meant to be," James said firmly. "Some things are just destined, Eleanor. You and me, we were always going to find each other. The blizzard was just the path that led us together." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I like that idea." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Inside the house, they could hear Thomas and his new wife Sarah preparing dinner, the sounds of ordinary domestic life that Eleanor had once thought she would never have again. "James," Eleanor said softly, "if I could go back and change anything about my life, I would not. Every hardship, every loss, every moment of fear and loneliness led me to you, and that makes it all worthwhile." James turned to look at her, his gray eyes still as clear and true as they had been that first day. "I love you, Eleanor Cordell. I have loved you from that moment in the blizzard, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Eleanor replied. "Thank you for filling my shed with wood. Thank you for staying to keep me warm. Thank you for never leaving." "I never will," James promised, and kissed her as the Montana sky spread out above them, vast and beautiful and eternal. They had decades more together. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with the continued growth of their ranch, with the deepening of a love that had started in desperation and grown into something magnificent. When James finally passed away at the age of 79, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Eleanor holding his hand. She followed him 2 years later, having lived a life far fuller and richer than she had ever imagined possible. Their children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, telling stories of the couple who had built an empire from nothing but love and determination. The Blizzard Creek Ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management and eventually passed to his children and his children's children, a legacy that stretched into the future. But more than the land or the cattle or the house they had built, Eleanor and James left behind something more precious. They left the legacy of what it means to grab hold of love when it appears, to fight for each other through every storm, and to build a life based on respect, partnership, and devotion. They left the story of a woman collecting firewood in a blizzard and a cowboy who filled her shed and stayed to keep her warm, and in doing so, warmed both their hearts for all the years to come. Theirs was a love story that became legend in their corner of Montana, told and retold through generations. A reminder that sometimes the worst storms bring the greatest blessings, and that love, when it is true and deep and fought for, can weather anything life throws at it. Eleanor and James had found each other in the cold and chaos of a blizzard, and they had built a warmth that lasted lifetimes, a love that never dimmed, a home that sheltered not just their bodies but their very souls. And in the end, that was everything.